Welcome back if you're returning. Today's video's quite a busy one. We have 6 DIY thrifted fall decor ideas. Some of these are a little bit out of the ordinary, not something that you'd see all the time. And by special request for Bonnie, she'd asked me to look into some horse brass ideas, so that's coming up at the end. But first, 4 botanicals. I picked up these 2 smaller canvases from the dollar store. These are the smallest ones you can get, I believe. I have 2 Mod Podges. There's a gloss one and a matte one. To be quite honest, even the matte one is quite glossy, so it doesn't matter which one you use. I printed off these 2 prints to fit the little canvases. I found these on the Graphics Fairy, and what I was looking for was vintage botanicals, autumn. That's what I looked up, and I came up with these 2 little pig prints. I sized them to fit the little canvases that I had, and then printed them out in black and white. And then what I've done is I've gone over the top of them with watercolours. Now, these watercolours are something that I've had for a very long time, but you can pick these up from the dollar store. They're literally $2. It's mostly water with a little colouring, and this to me gives a more authentic botanical, historic botanical look. You want to wait until it's dried completely. I laid mine out in the sun. So once they're completely dry, we're going to cut them out. So we're going to leave a slight little border around them. You don't have to, you can cut straight round it, or you can leave a bigger border. It's up to you. It all depends on the size of the canvas that you're trying to fit. So the next step is to put the Mod Podge on the surface of the canvas. So you cover that completely, then you lay your picture. I laid mine central because I was going to add a little bit of writing to the top and the bottom, and then you cover it completely with the second layer of Mod Podge. Now you can wait for the layer underneath that's sticking it to the canvas to dry. I don't. I find it works as long as you give it a really good pressing and make sure that all the bubbles are out. I have no issues with it once it's dry. I did go back and I printed off the Latin name for the harvest, and also the Latin name for the melon and the pumpkin, and then Mod Podge those on the same way as I'd done the prints. Gave it one last coat and that was done. These 4 branches were so easy and so effective. I picked up these 3 packets of leaves for 50 cents in a recent thrift haul. In the backyard I grabbed some branches. I paired up my leaves and I stuck one to the front, one to the back, all the way through the branches. And what I ended up with were 2 really beautiful branches that don't have to be watered. Leaves aren't going to fall off. I put them in a jar and they look just great. This French country inspired fall arrangement was something that was inspired by an arrangement that I saw at Home Sense. I think it was $120. This was a little urn that I've had for many years. This year it finally rusted through, so I've brought it in, cleaned it off, and just took my glue gun and stuck it back together. So I set that aside to dry, and this is a little glass pumpkin that I picked up from the same thrift haul where I found the leaves for 50 cents. This was also 50 cents. It was painted gold and it had little diamonds on it, so I put it to soak in the sink and got all the paint and the diamonds off. Then I removed the little pad off the bottom, and then I was going to paint it inside out. So I grabbed my metallic silver paint and some of the paint that I picked up from Michael's the other week, mixed them together, shook them up and lined the inside of the pumpkin. So I took the silver paint, I took the it was like a creamy colour paint with little gold flecks in it, and I mixed them together, and then I poured the mixture with a little bit of water inside the pumpkin, and then I literally just rolled it around and coated the inside of the pumpkin. Once it was all coated, I then put it upside down so it could drain out the rest of the paint back into the jar. I didn't like the silver, too much of the silver, so I kept adding in the little gold flecked paint, which actually turned out to be fabric paint, but it gave it a really nice effect. So I would absolutely recommend mixing in fabric paint with your regular paint. It turned out really quite nicely. So all I'm doing here is just making sure that the paint is coating all of the inside of the pumpkin. You can see, because there's little ridges in it, just have to hold it in place so that it's all covered. And then once it's done, you'd literally tip it right back upside down and back into the jug, so that the paint all pours back out, and you only have, it's coated the inside but there's no excess. So once the paint had drained from the inside of the pumpkin, I added a little more water to it and then coated the outside of the urn just to match them, because it was more silver than I would have liked, but I liked the finish of the inside of the pumpkin. So because this was very rusty and rustic, I thought I'd give it a very, very quick coat of the watered down colours that were inside the pumpkin, and just went over it and where it was a little bit thicker with a damp cloth just to sponge it off a little bit, so it was more of a uniform finish, and it's more of a coating than an opaque colour. So once that's done and dried, we can start adding our florals. These were from the picks that I picked up from Michael's. So I broke off a couple of branches, then pulled the leaves from the stems and then cut them all up individually. I then chose the rest of the colours that I wanted. I had some little yellow stems, I had some blue stems, lots of greenery, lots of different shades of greenery, and literally just chopped them off long enough for them to hang over the rim of the urn. And then once they were all cut off, you see I had ferns and different leaves, then I started to stick them with the glue gun around the rim of the urn. Now I could have used an oasis, but I didn't have any, and I figured this was probably a little bit more permanent, because this is something that I will use, I think, year after year. And here we see I'm just adding layers and layers of different greenery. I'm mixing them up. I'm adding a layer of green, then I'm adding a little bit of florals, and so on until it's built up and I've got the colours and the look that I'm going for. You could add anything to this. You could add ribbons, you could add longer greenery, you could add ivy, whatever the look you were going for, and then add in some colour that either matches your decor or the theme of your fall rooms. Now this next 12 pumpkin, I've had a really hard time this year trying to find pumpkins in any of the stores. I know it's a little early, but normally we have them coming out the yin yang. So I grabbed this one from the dollar store. I would much rather have had a plain one and I would have painted it, but I was making do. So I grabbed this glitzy one. I took the stem off the top, and this is the one that I'm going to be making into a little toile pumpkin. Again, I'm using the Mod Podge. Now I had strips of toile that was left over from when I redid my chair and my pillows, so I cut them into strips long enough to fit completely around the perimeter of the little pumpkin. I then made the hole bigger in the top because the material is going all the way around the pumpkin and it then is being tucked into the top of the pumpkin. So you need enough room in there for the material to bunch and to stay in. With this one, I did have a slight area where you could still see the pumpkin underneath, so I had a little piece of fabric that was just scrap and I glued that to that area and then re-wrapped the pumpkin. All the edges were covered and you can't see any of the pumpkin underneath. And once this is done, you're going to give it a really good coat with the Mod Podge, wait for that to dry, and then stick your little stem back into the top. You can see here I did go back in and dig out some more of the polystyrene just to make sure that the bulk of the material was in and the stem still fits as well. So that's all that was. I went back to remove a little bit more of the polystyrene to make sure everything fits in properly. So the next step is to cover the whole thing with a really good layer of Mod Podge. You want to make sure all the corners are flat and everything's been pressed down, and then once it's all dry you're going to stick your little stem back on top. I then went over again with a second coat and then left that to dry. The velvet pumpkin, this one came about, I found a pumpkin at for $1 at the thrift store, the ugliest pumpkin you'll ever see. I cut the stem off the top and then decided I was going to paint it, but then I thought, you know what, if I'm making a velvet pumpkin, if the velvet's dark enough, and I knew that I had some of the navy velvet left, it should cover it all up. And it did. So what I did was I wrapped the whole pumpkin in the navy blue velvet, tucking it all in as I go into the top. Once the velvet is all tucked in, I replaced the stem that I took off and it wasn't big enough. So I grabbed some modelling clay, and on top of the little stem that I had, I made a more substantial stem, moulded it so that it looked almost real, painted it silver, and then stuck it back onto the top of the finished velvet pumpkin. So this 4 quotes banner is a little different. Rather than have the lettering, I picked up these little tags with the little rope and decided rather than letters I'll put 4 quotes. I had Emily Bronte, Shakespeare, all sorts, and I printed them twice because you want one on the front and one on the back, so when it's hanging you can see them both sides. I then cut all the little quotes out and stuck one on the front and one on the back, and I did this with all of my quotes. So I cut my ropes to length and then made some tassels, and for some reason lost the little video of me making the tassels, but I think everybody knows how to make these tassels. They're very basic. You wrap them around your fingers, you use the blah blah blah. Anyway, I made enough to fit in between each of the quotes. I then had some little leaves and some little pumpkins. The pumpkins were from the Dollar Tree. They were in one of my recent shopping hauls, and the leaves again are from the same 50-cent 3 bags thrift haul. So I went along, tied up my quote and then a tassel, and then on the top of each tassel I put a little leaf and a pumpkin. I added the little pumpkins and the leaves because that's what I had at hand, but you could add beads or rags or ribbons, anything you want that suits your scheme and looks along with the look you're going for. This is not actually going on my fireplace. This is going to go in my kitchen or dining nook, but you'll have to stay tuned for the fall house tour coming up in a couple of weeks to see where everything ends up. So Bonnie had asked me to come up with some ideas for some horse brasses that she'd been gifted from a friend from the UK. These are the horse brasses, and she asked because I'd picked these up in a haul recently. They are very popular. They're antique. They are usually found on the wall or displayed. So what I thought was, I had this shadow box. I pulled off my little butterflies and then lined it with this blue velvet. This is just what I had at hand. I would have really liked to have a nice red, white and blue, but the velvet turned out really nice. I then had these little tags that came off a tapestry that was supposed to have been hung. I ended up framing it and then kept this border and tags. So it's the tags that I've cut off and threaded them through the top of the horse metal. And then what I've done is I've trimmed off all the little bits, glued them together and then turned them back on themselves. This is another way that they display them in the UK. You have a strip of material. What I've done here is I've folded it at the bottom to give it a point and then left a little loop so you can tie some ribbon through to hang it. You could also put a tassel off the bottom. I do have something similar in my living room, and then again with the same little tags, glue them on or pin them on all the way up the little display, and that's how you usually see them in the UK. That's how they're hung, by the fireplace or in, wherever you want to display them. So I do have some somewhere. As soon as I take them out of storage, I will show you how they are normally displayed. But I really ended up liking the idea of the shadow box. So this is how they turned out, and they almost look like medals, I think. So I've actually kept those and I've hung them on my wall. So thanks, Bonnie. You've inspired me. So once again, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't, and give me a thumbs up. It really helps my channel. We'll see you next time.